So welcome everybody, and welcome to another MES seminar. Kathy Murray is going to introduce our esteemed speaker, Eric Frohmberg. But I just want to let you know a little bit about MES. It's an organization that actually allows amateur and professional entomologists or entomology wannabes to share their love of insects and similar bugs. It does a lot of things. It hosts this series, obviously, and during the summer and all the warm months, it hosts a series of monthly walks in different parts of the state. Um, Under the auspices of Charlene Donahue, it has been for years upgrading the insect collection at the Maine State Museum. And we also have a scholarship program for education or research for people who want to and need a little extra money. Right now, it's limited to $500, but we hope through fundraising in the future that we actually can expand that. So you can find all about MES and learn about future webinars and walks by going to the website mainentosociety.org or just Google Maine Entomological Society. So with that boring introduction, I now welcome Kathy Murray, who's going to introduce our speaker.
Okay, great. Thank you, Roger. And you're still in charge of letting people in, right? As they hit the waiting room.
Oh man, thank you for reminding me.
So we have a little bit of a clunky Zoom going, but yeah, so welcome. I'm one of the Kathy Murrays. There's two of us at MES. One of them has a PhD, and that's not me. I'm the more generalist Kathy Murray on the Maine Ento Executive Committee, and came to it through the Maine Master Naturalist Program. And I see there's a number of naturalists joining us tonight, which is cool. But the main thing is to tell you about Eric Frohmberg, who is our guest speaker tonight on aquatic insects and their behavior and how they interact with those who want to eat them. So you probably read his bio when you registered, but basically Eric got interested in insects real early in life, and it just never left him. One of the things I liked talking with Eric about this earlier tonight is that he really expanded his interest and knowledge about entomology through mentorship from people in the generation before him who were lepidopterists and coleopterists, and reminding us that we all have an important role to play as mentors as we go along in life. But growing up in Kansas, fishing in the Ozarks, and ultimately in the DC area, fly fishing for native brookies in the Shenandoahs. He really got into the aquatic insects. And some of you may know Eric because he and his wife Selene own this great fly shop in Gardiner along Cobsey Stream. I live nearby, and I love seeing them out in the stream teaching people what's what with fly fishing. But Eric runs great podcast, the Angler's Entomologist podcast, which I've observed, and he has these quizzes that you can do through his website to see if you know your aquatic insects. So after tonight's webinar, you might want to go look at what he offers to continue your education. Professionally, he works in public health, his day job, but really, Eric, you want to be out in the water with your fish, with your insect. So I'm going to turn it over to Eric now, turn off my camera and mute, and I'll encourage others to do the same. And Eric will share slides and tell us a lot. Thanks.
Eric, before you start, let me just ask a question. If anybody has a question, would you prefer they wait to the end, or?
I say it's a small group, so I say if you have questions.
We have 25 participants.
Well, I mean, if I'm good if folks, I'm a very relaxed speaker, so if folks want to just chime in and interrupt, I'm 100% good with that. The only catch is that I don't think I'll be able to see if someone raises their hand or something like that. So if Roger or Kathy want to interrupt me if somebody has a question. That would be great.
So if you have a question, put it in the chat. I'll keep monitoring that and will on occasion interrupt Eric and ask your question for you. At the end, you'll be able to unmute yourself and ask your own questions if you wish. Okay.
That sounds great. So, and just to check, can folks see my slide here?
Yeah, it looks great, Eric.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So, my name is Eric Frohmberg. Thanks for the very nice introduction, Kathy. My wife owns Selene's Fly Shop in Gardiner, Maine, and I have a podcast called Anglers Entomology Podcast, which is all about entomology as it relates to fly fishing. And although I have to admit it's a little bit on hiatus right now, mostly because folks at work are working me a little bit hard. So, in my public health job. So, but what I wanted to do today was talk a little bit about aquatic insects and fly fishing and fly tying and that interrelationship. It's kind of a interesting way to look at entomology, and I thought folks might enjoy that. And I have to admit, I always have ulterior motives. So my goals of this talk, whenever I give talks to anglers, I always say my goal is to convert them into entomologists. And so tonight, my goal is also to convert some entomologists into fly anglers, and we'll see if I'm successful with that. But also, I really think it is opening up a world of beauty. I mean, being out there on the stream and observing the aquatic insects and in their environment is really just breathtaking. And I feel very lucky to live in Maine and have access to some of these just incredible spots that my wife and I find as we're running around in the willywags. But then also, I wanted to promote a program called Stream Explorers, which we'll talk about in a fair bit. That's a program through the Maine Audubon that's all about classifying streams based on the aquatic microinvertebrates that are found in them. And it's a great program. So first, though, I thought I'd give you a little bit of background about, what's the deal with fly fishing. Like so many things, you can define it in multiple ways. One of the easiest ways to, or the most practical way of defining fly fishing that's visible is when you're casting a fly rod, you're actually casting the weight of the line, which is this curved thing there. Can you see my cursor?
Yep.
Moving on this? Yeah. So that's the fly line that's flowing through the air, and you're actually casting the not so much the weight of the fly rind as much as its air resistance, because the fly that you have at the end of the line is actually virtually weightless. So that's kind of a boring definition of fly fishing. In a lot of ways, though, it's a lot more than that. I mean, one of the things I think a lot of scientists enjoy fly fishing because it's really solving puzzles. Where when you get on the stream, the first question is, where are the fish? And then secondly, you're trying to figure out what the fish are feeding on and how to fool them with an imitation. So that's one definition, and it's very much puzzle solving. It's also the case, though, that fly fishing is really healing. When you're out there on the water, you literally just let everything else go. And it's incredibly calming and a beautiful activity. There's actually a movie right now out on Netflix called Mending the Line, which is about a veteran who is, it's about a lot of things, but the premise is a veteran is told to try fly fishing as part of his therapy. And that's not just a Hollywood thing. It actually happens all over the country. There are multiple veterans groups that promote fly fishing and fly tying as a way to help deal with PTSD, as well as other impacts of the military. As a matter of fact, there's one group that comes to our fly shop every Wednesday and ties flies there. And there's other groups too. For example, there's a group called Casting for Recovery, which teaches women survivors of breast cancer how to fly fish. And at the shop, we like to say that fly fishing is a lifetime hobby or a lifetime sport, because there are many different ways you can approach it and many things that you could focus on at various times. So, for example, you could focus on the aquatic entomology if you want, or you could focus on the technique of casting, or the different types of fly fishing there are, or you can focus on the conservation. Conservation is really important to a lot of fly anglers. For example, our Trout Unlimited group down in Brunswick this last year helped remove a dam that was impounding what is a really nice trout stream. What's the name of it? Cross Gully Brook that runs through Freeport. And I should also say that most fly anglers who fly fish, or many, practice catch and release, where really the goal is to catch the fish and release it unharmed so it can continue its life unharmed. But I would also be remiss in saying that a lot of fly fishing, there are another major aspect of fly fishing is, in some ways, it's kind of baloney, in the sense that when you're out there and you're trying to solve a puzzle and you come up with a fly and you catch a fish on that fly, you congratulate yourself thinking that you've solved the puzzle. But what's tricky about that is that nobody knows what the fish is thinking. They could have seen your fly and thought, oh my God, what the heck is that? The only way I'm going to find out is by tasting it. And they do, and that's how you catch them. So a lot of what actually happens and how we interpret it is very different. And that makes it kind of humbling and also fun at the same time. So, as I said, one of the things that you do when you fly fish is fish an imitation of an insect or a minnow on the end of your fly line. And another part of that hobby is fly tying, which is taking materials, synthetics and naturals, and basically lashing them onto a hook to imitate an insect. And these are some examples here. And part of the fun of that is also learning all the characteristics of those materials and using them in their best way. So, for example, the one on the far left, that is what's called a Goddard caddis, and it imitates a caddisfly. But what's interesting about it is all this material back here, that's deer hair. And it turns out that deer hair is hollow, and so it's buoyant. And when you lash it onto a hook like that, you can actually spin it around and then trim it to make it that particular shape and make it buoyant. And then these fibers here, what that actually is, that's rooster neck feathers that you wrap around the hook. And they're very stiff, and they're stiff enough so it'll actually sit on top of the surface tension of the water. And then here in the middle, what we have is a dragonfly imitation, obviously. And again, this is deer hair that's used to make the body and to make the wings. And then the fly on the end here, this is an Adams. It's a style of fly called the Catskill style fly that was invented in the Catskill Mountains by a fellow named Theodore Gordon. And it's interesting in that, again, what you have here are the feather barb from a rooster. And again, this is wrapped around the feather barbs from a rooster to make that hackle that it sits on when it sits in the water. And then this is dubbing, which is just fibers basically that are wrapped around the hook. And then these are little feather tips that are up there to make the wings. And so a lot of fly tying is looking at the insect that you're trying to imitate and then coming up with a pattern that imitates them. And there are some pros and cons to this. A lot of folks, the argument that I make is that there are certain times in the insect's life that puts it more at risk to being fed on than others. And the fish, of course, can be very key into those behaviors when they're happening and sometimes be very picky about that and eat only those things that they're seeing. The way I like to think about it is, I don't know if you have seen those sushi restaurants in Japan where you have um, a belt that's going around and there's different sushi dishes that travel on it and the diners pick out what they want off of that belt. Well, if they're all looking for sushi, they're going to be surprised and unlikely to take a Big Mac when it comes around. And fish are the same way when they're seeing insects drift by as they're in the water. And there's really kind of two styles of fly tying. One is focuses more on a realistic pattern, like this cicada up here in the left. But I would argue that in a lot of ways, there are other patterns that are more effective because what the fish really want to see is that behavior. So again, thinking about the sushi example, you're expecting to see sushi come around. And if you see sushi that's moving around on the plate, that's obviously not one that you would pick. Um, so it's what you want is something that the fish are used to seeing and a behavior that they cue into. So this picture in the middle is one of my favorite pictures. It's from a guide out west who was on my podcast tying cicada patterns and very helpfully wrote "bite me" on the flies so the fish know to eat the fly. But then if you look at the one at the right, that really doesn't look like anything. And what that is, that's called a LaFontaine sparkle pupa. And it actually represents a caddisfly that is hatching from the bottom. And that material, that green material that's wrapped around the hook, is actually antron. And what that does is it captures the bubble of air or bubbles of air as it sinks from the surface. And that bubble of air, often a lot of these aquatic insects will use air bubbles to help rise from the bottom or as they're developing. And it's a great fly pattern. So that's an example of something where you're really imitating more of the behavior and what the fish see rather than what we as anglers see in the insect. So let me talk about Carolus linnaeus, in part because he's my hero. I love Carolus Linnaeus because he's the guy who developed the binomial system of nomenclature. And part of what he did, which I really like, was come up with the different categories that we use, families, orders, genera, that kind of thing, to categorize insects, as you all know. And what I like about that is, in theory, it should follow the evolutionary relationships between the insects. And that's important because if you think about it, in Maine, there's some 200 species of mayflies in Maine alone. And most anglers and a lot of us as amateur entomologists, there's no way we're going to learn how to identify all those different species just by sight. And more importantly, the fish don't care. But what you can do is learn about the different families. And that's a lot more achievable. And once you learn about who the different families are, those characteristics are often shared within that family. Those behavioral characteristics, as well as other characteristics that are important for fly fishing. So it takes something that can be really overwhelming and narrows it down into something that's achievable and practical for fly fishing. So let's talk a little bit about what makes aquatic entomology so cool from my perspective. And one of the things that's interesting about aquatic insects is, they evolved as terrestrial insects from, and then later colonized freshwater environments later. And so you kind of have to ask, well, what's the advantage of being an aquatic insect? And there's a couple of them. One of them has to do with the really cool characteristics of water. Water is interesting in that it is one of the things it does is when it goes from a liquid to a solid, it actually increases or decreases its density, so it's lighter. And you all see that when you put an ice cube in a glass of water, the ice cube floats. And what that means from a practical perspective, though, is lakes will freeze from the top. And so there's always liquid water underneath. And flowing water, as you often see in streams around Maine in the winter, doesn't freeze at all. And even something like the Kennebec River, which does freeze over, again, you have moving water underneath. So it acts as a buffer for winters. So while a lot of terrestrial insects will become dormant or go through the winter as an egg stage, aquatic insects are still very much alive and active in the water during the winter. And so that makes it an entomology hobby that you can participate in all year round. So that picture on the right there of me, we were collecting insects for a fly fishing expo up in Bethel a couple of years ago, and that was first thing in the morning, and it was -1 degrees. And believe me, that water was cold. The air was even colder, and getting wet was no fun. But collecting those insects, we were able to scoop them up, put them in a bucket of water, and they were great. They were great for the show. The other thing that is cool about aquatic insects is it separates the life stages. So, we all think about insects with a complete metamorphosis, like a butterfly or a moth, where the larvae don't necessarily compete with the adult for the same resources. Well, the exact same thing happens with aquatic insects, even if they have an incomplete metamorphosis. So, what you have here on the left is a dragonfly nymph, which has an incomplete metamorphosis, is aquatic in its nymphal stage or larval or nymphal stage, but then as an adult is terrestrial, and hence they don't really compete. And the adult, having wings, has the ability to disperse and colonize new water bodies. So let's talk, what we'll do is talk about some of the major categories of insects that are important for fly fishing and talk a little bit about how we imitate them. Mayflies are always considered really important for fly fishing. They have a long history, in part because in a lot of areas of the countries, you end up with huge hatches of mayflies that trout will really key in on and just feed on those mayflies or that particular species, or then even more so, that particular stage of their life cycle. So what we have here in the upper left-hand corner, anglers and entomologists also divide mayflies into nymphal groups that aren't really taxonomic, but they are useful. So categories include things like crawler nymphs, which crawl around on the bottom. They're not very good swimmers. Minnow-like mayflies, which is what this is over here, or a swimming mayfly, which are very minnow-shaped, and they're often very active swimmers. This particular fellow is a leadwing coachman nymph. And then there's clinger mayflies, which cling on the rocks, in particular in fast-moving water in riffles, and they tend to be very flat and hydrodynamic. And then lastly, there are the burrowing mayflies, which burrow in the substrate and in little U-shaped burrows. And knowing those different categories, again, you learn, you can think about them in terms of behavior when you're fishing and what imitations to pick. And then additionally, the mayflies have this developmental steps which put them at risk for predation. So for example, you can fish the nymph when they are active, as I said, this fellow up here is a lead-winged coachman. They're very active swimmers. And a great imitation of that is a fly called the pheasant-tail nymph, which interestingly is made out of the fibers of a pheasant tail that's tied here. That's what those fibers are. And then it's wrapped around the hook, with a little bit of a peacock fiber here. And then it's wrapped over the top to make the wing case, which you can see right there. And then there's a little brass bead to provide weight. And mayfly nymphs, though, also when they're ready to hatch, they'll often swim to the surface, depending on the species, and then molt into mayfly dun. And that step is, again, a step where they are at risk of predation. And so that's what we have in this picture here. This is a hexagenia dun, and this is a fly called the hexamungus, which was invented by my wife. And it represents that stage of an emerger when they're on the surface trying to hatch out. So those fibers back there from a wood duck represent the spent shuck. You have the body here, and then the wings as the insect is climbing out of its spent shuck. Mayflies, though, when they hatch, they actually have an extra stage before they're reproductively active. Mayflies are the only insect that actually can, I shouldn't say, the only one that I know of that molts once they have wings. So this stage here, called the subimago, and anglers call it duns. And then you have the imago, which anglers call spinners. Duns, and this is a hexagenia, duns typically have kind of a dull color to them, in particular the wings, in part because they're covered with hairs, hydrophobic hairs, which help shed the water, and that helps them float as they hatch out of the water. And then they fly to the shore, trees near the shore, and they'll molt once again and become reproductively active spinners, where they will mate, reproduce, and lay their eggs. And while there's different strategies that they have for laying their eggs, like some of them will drop their eggs from the air like bombers, others will dap their abdomen onto the water, others will land on a rock and then crawl into the water to lay their eggs. And you can, by understanding that behavior, you can adapt your fly fishing to match that. And there are fly patterns that are used to imitate these stages. So we talked about the Catskill style fly pattern that we saw before, but there's also this pattern here, which is called a comparadun, where what they do is use a floating material. In this case, these are the fibers from a duck, the feathers around a duck's oil preening gland. And they tend to be very hydrophobic and float well. So it makes a good material to use on a fly that floats. And then when they mate and reproduce, they often die and land in the water with their wings spread out. And hence you have spinner patterns like this that often have material or wings going out to the side, which help float the pattern. Let's talk a little bit about caddisflies. Unlike mayflies, which have an incomplete metamorphosis, caddisflies have a complete metamorphosis. We often think of them as the fellows that make the little cases, but there's other caddisflies that are free living or actually make little silk nets that they use to capture insects and detritus floating by that they feed on. And when they live in this larval stage, they then will pupate. So you'll have a larva like this, it'll pupate, And then there's another interesting stage where they swim from their pupal case. In this case, for this particular species, it's silk. They often make them out of petals on the bottom of the stream. But then they will hatch out and they will swim to the surface in this ferrate stage, and then they'll molt once again into the adult reproductively active caddisfly. And there are imitations for most of these stages. So as you can see with this guy, you can look at him and say, well, he's not likely to be a very good swimmer, and that's indeed the case. And so when you're fishing, you imitate that behavior, while with a mayfly, you might be more active in how you fish the mayfly nymph. With a caddisfly like this, you're much more likely to drift it along the bottom of the stream. Like I said, there's imitations for all of these. So here's a caddisfly larval imitation that's designed by an angler named Oliver Edwards. He was a very famous angler in England and just died in 2023. He invented a lot of very nice patterns. But then that ferrate stage, this is called a spider or a soft tackle, where in this case, the body is made out of a fiber of peacock, although you can also make them with just thread. And then again, all this is a feather that's wrapped around the neck to form all those fibers below, which pulse in the water when you are fishing it and look like those legs of the ferrate caddisfly swimming to the surface. And then this is a what's called an elk hair caddis, where again, it uses, in this case, elk hair or deer hair, which is hollow and floats, as well as the rooster fibers to help it sit on the surface of the water. But it's also the case that a lot of caddisflies will actually lay their eggs by diving into the water and swimming down to the bottom or onto a rock and laying their eggs. And so a lot of these types of flies, which are called wet flies, and they're a very old fly going back to the 1500s, can imitate that stage. And I like to think about flies in kind of an analogous way to evolution, in that everyone's coming up with patterns all the time. And it's sort of a form of natural selection. Those that are successful stick around and become standards, while those that aren't successful get lost or become extinct. Let's talk a little bit about stoneflies. Stoneflies have an incomplete metamorphosis, so they go from a nymph into an adult. And in stoneflies, the nymphs are always usually what's most important. They're often very active in the streams, and what's nice about stoneflies is they have a lot of the same requirements that trout have, meaning they like cold, clean water. And so often in trout streams, you'll find nice stonefly populations. And one of my favorite imitations of a stonefly is actually this fly here, which was actually designed as a mayfly imitation, but I like it as a stonefly imitation. And it's called a one feather fly because it's literally made with one feather. And this is the feather that it's made out of. It's the flank of a wood duck, where these fibers here are what form the tail, and then that's wrapped around the shank to form the body. And these fluffy fibers down at the bottom are actually wrapped around to make the thorax. These fibers are folded over to form the wing case, and then folded back down to form the legs. So I like this fly because it's simple, it's easy to tie. And there's, of course, a ton of other critters out there. So I talked about mayflies, stoneflies, and caddisflies as some of the most common ones, but there's, of course, tons of other insects as well as other invertebrates out there. And we actually have a tank at the fly shop where we often hook up a microscope and project it onto a TV, so kids and folks can see what kind of insects are found in what kind of macroinvertebrates are found in the streams that I sample for the classes that we teach there. So, for example, this fellow here is Karen the crayfish, who lived in our shop for a while, and you can see her exoskeleton from her last molt. And then this little predaceous diving beetle over here was named Dwayne, after a friend's camp where I collected him, and he lived in the fly shop for a while. And then, of course, outside, there's tons of stuff. These are one of my favorites. This is a type of fish fly called Nigronia, super common in Maine. You see them all over the place. They're megalopteran, and they're kind of neat because they're one of the diurnal fish flies, so you can often see them fluttering around during the day. And they lay their eggs outside of the water. This is an egg mass that he's laid, and then when they hatch, they'll drop into the water, and you can often see those egg masses on things like bridges, concrete bridges, passing over a trout stream. And what's funny is everyone is coming up with new patterns for flies all the time. So I often joke that there is even more diversity in flies than there are the insects that we're trying to imitate. So each one of those little cubes down there is a pile of flies to imitate a particular type or stage of an insect. And we have, I would say, 9 or 10 of these boxes like this. And on the one hand, it makes it a little bit complicated and difficult for folks to choose flies. But on the other hand, that's also kind of the fun as well, trying to figure out what's the right fly that'll work on a particular stream for a particular fish on a particular day. And I should say that there is a dark side to all hobbies. Some people take it over the top and do things that they shouldn't do. This is an excellent book that I'd highly recommend. And as biologists, it will outrage you. I don't want to give away too much of it, but it's basically about a fly tyer who tied salmon flies. And I have to say, salmon flies are kind of the salmon fly tyers are a little bit odd anyway. But this guy even took it further and raided a natural history museum and stole museum specimens to use for fly tying material. And I won't tell you any more than that, but it's a really well written book, and I highly recommend it. But there's also some good Maine history around fly tying. Maine has a strong history around fly fishing and fly tying. The woman on the right here is Cornelia Flyrod Crosby. She grew up in Phillips, Maine, and she was the first registered Maine guide, even though she never guided any clients. She was the person who went to the state and said, look, we need a guide registration program so that when someone comes into Maine and they hire a guide, that person is qualified to guide people safely within the state. And so she got the first guide license because of that work. And it is, in fact, the case that Maine has one of the most rigorous guide certification processes in the country. When you hire a Maine guide, you're getting someone who knows what they're talking about. Anyway, she lived from the 1850s. It was really 1850s to around 1940. And as I said, she lived in Phillips, Maine. This person on the left here is Carrie Stevens. She is a famous fly tyer from the Rangeley area, and tied, in particular, a type of streamer that imitates fish, and was very famous for that, and beautiful, beautiful streamers. And if oh, and I should say, if you're interested in Carrie Stevens, you can go to the there's a museum up in Aquatic, Maine. I can't remember the name of it, but it's a very, very good museum. And it has the largest collection of Carrie Stevens flies in the world. It's really an impressive museum. But if you don't want to go to Aquatic, you can come to our fly shop in Gardiner, where we have some stuff that we've collected over the years. This little cabinet here against the bricks shows the evolution of those streamers that Carrie Stevens tied, and the different companies that bought her company after she retired. But one of the things that I'm most proud of in our collection here is, see this box in the glass case down here. This is a box that Carrie Stevens stored some of her feathers in. But what's really cool about it is it's actually her girdle box. So we have Carrie Stevens' girdle box. And this is one of the flies that Carrie Stevens, this is actually tied by my wife. And those are her hands up there, tying one of the Carrie Stevens flies. She does it in her hands without a vise, like Carrie Stevens tied them. So how do you learn more about aquatic entomology? Well, one answer is you get out there and you do it, and go out there and collect. And this picture on the left shows a drift net, which is basically a net you put in the water overnight. And it's interesting because what that does is it takes advantage of a behavior that the aquatic insects have, which is called behavioral drift, where at night they'll often let go and drift in the current as a way to distribute themselves along the stream. And if you put a net in like that, you'll end up with aquatic insects in there from overnight. But it doesn't have to be that involved. If you're out there canoeing and you drop an anchor and you pull up a bunch of weeds, throw those weeds in a white plastic bin and sit there and watch, and you'll be amazed at what comes crawling out of there, the amount of life in that. And then, of course, you can do some stream sampling, like through the Stream Explorers program, which we'll talk about in a moment. And I should say that at our shop, we do have some aquatic nets, as well as some seines, if folks are interested. So let's talk about Stream Explorers. This is a really great program. It's a citizen science initiative through Maine Audubon and the Department of Environmental Protection. And it works because EPA and the Department of Environmental Protection classify streams on their cleanliness or based on the aquatic life that's found in them. So you can go and sample a stream and identify different categories of aquatic life. So, for example, I mentioned that stoneflies like cold, clean streams, and supply that information through this program to DEP. And then they look at that information and make decisions based on where they should go back and sample in more detail to help classify the streams. And it's a great program. I really like it because it gets people out there in the streams and sampling and providing useful data for the DEP. But it's also a really great way to learn about aquatic insects and get more detail. And then lastly, if you want to learn more about fly fishing, stop by our shop in Gardiner, Maine. We have lots of classes on fly tying and fly fishing. We can get you set up with gear if you're interested. And one of the things I really love about fly shops is it's one of the few shops that I know about where you can just go and hang out and shoot the shit with us while we're there. We have a couple of nice shop dogs and a couple of easy chairs, and we have free coffee. And it's not uncommon for folks to join us and just sit around and talk. I'm almost always there on Saturdays. Usually during the week, I have an office in the back, and I'm usually stuck in there doing my day job. But sometimes I get to escape. And then also I have the Anglers Entomology podcast, which, like I said, is on hiatus right now, but I hope to get some time and put out some more episodes soon. So with that, I'll wrap up and open it up to questions. And I'll stop sharing so I can see folks.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Eric. That was a fascinating talk. If anybody has questions, you can either put it in the chat or just unmute yourself and ask the question. And Eric, I'll start with one. You're out fly fishing. How much of it is actually intellectually matching what you think will be around, and how much is empirical? That fly doesn't work. I'll try this one.
The answer is yes. It's a fair bit of both. Some days you have a good day and you can figure out what's going on. Other days, it's a lot more empirical, and other days it's doesn't matter what you do, you're completely unsuccessful. Even though when you're out there and not catching fish, though, it is hard not to have a good time because it is just so beautiful.
All right, thank you. So we have one comment. Thank you so much, and thanks to MES. Well, you're very welcome. Are there any other questions for Eric?
And before we get to other questions, I did put in the chat the address to the website for the Outdoor Heritage Museum, which is the one in Aquatic, with all that information about Carrie Stevens and other fascinating stuff, and the website for the Mainstream Explorers Program, which the training for this year will start up again in the next few weeks. And I've been a participant a few years, and like Eric, I love it. I love it. I've learned so much doing it.
And I should say we have one of the trainings will be at our fly shop in Gardiner this year.
Oh, great. Yeah, so I'm curious, Eric. I mean, you know so much by now, maybe you don't have to think about it too much, but if do people go and like sample before they fish? I mean, to figure out who's there and what stage they're at, what do you do?
So the answer is not enough. And that's one of the arguments I make when I talk to anglers is take the time to sit down on the riverbank and before you start fishing, observe and see what's happening both out of the water and in the water. So take a look in the shrubbery along the edge of the stream and see what kind of insects you see in the trees, and also pick up rocks and take a look and see what kind of aquatic insects you see on the rocks. The catch there, though, that I always like to emphasize is, you pick up a rock and there's a nymph, a pile of nymphs on them, and you pull it out. The nymphs aren't going to be behaving naturally. They're freaking out because they're no longer in the stream. So what I always suggest is you take the nymphs and put it in a calm area of the stream so you can see how they behave. And so you can think about how you want to imitate that as you're fishing. Now, that said, that's what I say. I have to admit, often when I go stream fishing, I'm so excited to be there. One of the first things I do is blunder into the water and start fishing instead of heeding my own advice and sit down and observe.
Eric, Phil asks, what's your favorite dry fly fish in the Rangeley area? Dry fly in the Rangeley area.
Well, I got to say, in Maine, caddis is king, or queen, depending on your mood. And while we don't have the huge we often don't have the same kind of huge mayfly hatches that they have in areas like the Catskills or further south, or the Adirondacks. There's often fantastic caddisfly hatches. And so I have to admit, for dry flies, I love kind of fond of elk-hair caddis. And again, it gets back to this thing of what is it that what we think we're fishing versus what the fish think. So the elk-hair caddis is a big bushy fly. It can represent a caddisfly, it can represent a stonefly that's fluttering on the surface. I've even used them to imitate grasshoppers when grasshoppers end up in the water.
I must say, I put a moth light out frequently during the summer, and there's a lot of aquatic insects that end up mayflies, caddisflies, that end up on the sheet, an amazing density at times. So that's another way of finding out what's emerging at that particular time.
Absolutely, and that's one of my wife and my favorite things is to go up into the willy wags. We hammock camp, and we fish during the day and collect insects, aquatic insects during the day, and then set up ultraviolet lights at night, and come back completely sleep deprived.
Do you have a field guide you can recommend for identifying aquatic macroinvertebrates?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There is a I can't remember the name of it. It's the field guide that I think of is they reference it in the Stream Explorers, and it's called something like the Aquatic Macroinvertebrates of North America. That's a really good one. I think it's out of print, but it is still out there. There is an excellent hatch guide put out by Thomas Ames Jr. For the Northeast, but that's out of print. And honestly, the ones that are out there go for about $150, and it's just a small little book. It's in high demand. Those. Oh, the other thing I should say though is the guide that you get with the Streaming Explorers program is excellent. And it has some nice keys, and will get you down to the major categories, which I highly recommend. And that's probably the best bet, and you can get it, download it for free off of their website.
The little Art Flicks book is a good book of
Yeah.
guide.
Yep, Art Flick was a fly fisher in the New York region in the 40s and 50s. The catch with his book is that a lot of the scientific names, of course, have changed.
Well, Eric, if there's no more questions, I want to thank you again. This has been just a wonderful presentation. Do I remember correctly that you're actually going to do an insect walk for Maine Entomological Society?
Not this year. We may do it at some point in the future. Unfortunately, work has been kind of busy for me, but that might be something coming up in the future.
It's terrible how work does that.
I know it is. It's horrible, isn't it?
Eric,
But
can you
on the
tell
other
us?
hand, it's nice to be able to pay the bills.
Right. Can you tell us a little bit more about your classes and what you do in your classes?
Sure. So we have classes at the fly shop. We have a class this weekend on caddisflies. And what we do is we go through the major groups, different types of caddisflies, talk about their behavior, similar to this, but in a lot more detail. One of the things we also do, though, is I'll go out and take a stream sample and bring it into the class, and we'll use that to sort through the sample and identify the caddisflies that we see and other aquatic insects. Like I said, we have a caddisfly class coming up this Saturday. The Saturday after that, I think, is stoneflies. And then we're going to have a class where we actually go out and we do some stream sampling and see what we can find. And if you go to selenesflyshop.com, you can see what classes are there and sign up for them. And again, folks should feel free to stop by the fly shop. It's a friendly place. And it's always fun to sit down, have a cup of coffee and or cup of tea and talk about stuff.
Great. Thanks again. And thanks to all of you for attending.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Eric.
Thanks, Eric.